Welcome to another virtual Live Talks Los Angeles event. We welcome to our screen Lisa Napoli to talk about her new book, Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News. Lisa began her career as an unpaid teenage intern at CNN's New York bureau in the summer of 1981. As a journalist since, she has worked at the New York Times, Public Radio's Marketplace, MSNBC, and KCRW here in Los Angeles. She's the author of two previous books, Radio Shangri-La and Ray and Joan. Interviewing Lisa is Frank Buckley, an anchor at KTLA Morning News. He joined KTLA in June of 2005 from CNN, where he had been a national correspondent. He is also the host of Frank Buckley Interviews, a podcast. They'll chat for a while, and then we'll take some audience questions that were submitted in advance. So welcome to both of you.
Thanks. Hi.
Thanks a lot, Ted. And Lisa, good to see you again. Congratulations on another terrific book. It must feel great to have it out.
It does. It's exciting. And so far I'm getting good feedback. So that really feels good. Better than bad feedback.
Right.
So yes.
That's always good. Again, the book is Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News. And I thought we'd start there with the birth of 24-hour news, as you did in your book. You start with a live breaking news event that happened right here in Southern California, actually in San Marino. And the TV station that I work for now, KTLA, is right in the middle of it. It is the focus of chapter one.
Yes.
It's April 1949. Tell us about a 3-year-old girl named Kathy Fiscus. What happened?
Very accidentally, the little girl was playing in the backyard in San Marino and she fell into a well. Her mother called the cops to get some help. The help came and then the press came. But of course, in 1949, there wasn't much television. Television was just finding its sea legs and it was really not sure how to handle news. But the very inventive station manager at KTLA wanted to find a way to broadcast this out because he knew this was an incredible human interest story. So by hook and crook and just sort of climbing poles and manufacturing a way to create a live shot, they had a live shot of the entire rescue operation, which sounds so quaint and retro or very modern right now. But the reality is that had never been done before. And people were driving up to appliance stores and begging the owners of the appliance stores to please keep the television on. There weren't that many televisions at that point. I think it was less than under 10,000 in all of the LA metro area. And people were going to people's homes. They were sitting up all night watching the screen, waiting for this little girl to be rescued. So that sort of predates, or very much predates, modern television news. But it was the first time somebody realized that human interest might be compelling enough that people would sit and watch and be glued like a sporting event.
And as a writer, you have so many choices and such rich material here when we're talking about the birth of 24-hour news coverage, about the birth of CNN. You chose to pick this event. Why this particular event?
Well, I thought it was really interesting, A, to go all the way back and see where it started, but B, the end of the book, not to give it away, is that the number one highest rated event on CNN in its first 10 years was the rescue of a little girl from a well. So it was so interesting to see, and some people may remember that, baby Jessica. Actually, there's some people out there who may even remember this little girl in San Marino, but they were so similar in the sense of being a seminal moment in the creation of various media, both television, but different kinds of television at different moments in time in society.
So it provided a framework for you.
Yeah, because there were so many, it was so complicated to figure out how do you tell the story of CNN. When you worked there was totally different than when I was a kid working there versus people who work there today. So I just wanted to zero in on the earliest days. And when I read that story about Kathy Fiscus, I just thought, wow, it's so, I had, of course, had no idea when I first started researching. And it was so similar to what happened in 1987 with the little girl in Midland that it seemed like a perfect bookend.
Yeah. You referenced the CNN that you worked at and that I worked at. It's interesting. I'm sort of in the middle. You were there early on. I was there from 99 to 2005, and then we are where we are today. And clearly the company is a different sort of a news organization. I think that many of our colleagues, one who I'm going to reference in a moment, are still there, outstanding, mission-driven journalists who care deeply about telling the story and informing the public in an objective, non-biased way. I don't know that all of the presenters have a similar point of view, and I don't want to get too deep into that because that's not really what your book is about. But let's talk about the start of your sort of experience with CNN. As Ted mentioned, you started there as an unpaid intern. You call the CNN bureau, and a guy that I worked with and you would work with, Richard Roth, answers the phone.
It's so funny to tell the story now, because when you think of CNN now, it is a major multinational corporation that, to get an internship there, I can't even imagine how hard it is, how competitive it is, how bureaucratic it is. But and the only reason I even tell this story, because this book is absolutely not about me, but when I was 17 years old and in New York City for the summer working at a video store, and I wanted to break into the business, and I had absolutely no idea how and zero connections. And a guy I went to high school with saw the CNN bureau in the World Trade Center, which was in the lobby when you first walked in. That's where his summer internship was. And he just told me, hey, there's this thing, Cable News Network. And most of us didn't know what cable was at that point, because the world was not, the nation was not wired for cable yet. Right. So we didn't have it. So when I just called information and got the number and then called, and Richard Roth answered the phone desk, I'll never forget it, and said, yeah, sure, come on in and do an internship. It's just so preposterous that it, has evolved. Nobody thought that CNN would ever last a couple of years, much less 40 years, much less become what it became. And so the idea that you were able to just literally show up and answer phones was phenomenal. I mean, it was phenomenal for me, and it made many a career, and probably broke a lot of people too from the business, but it was just such an incredible time. It was so different.
Yeah.
As was KTLA.
Right, absolutely.
Right, when it started.
Right. Let's talk about how it all started, how CNN started. And it seemed to me, reading your book, that it really, I don't want to say that it was an accident, but it came as a result of Ted Turner's father dying by suicide. Ted inherits his father's nearly bankrupt billboard company. And how is he going to save the company? He's going to spend even more money and buy a UHF TV station in Atlanta.
Right. It's so, as you say, improbable, because it's not like Ted, as you and I assume you did this too. You wanted to be a journalist. You wanted to get out there. You wanted to work in the news. It's not like Ted had this dying passion to do the news. In fact, he didn't watch the news. He didn't like the news. He inherited this company. It wasn't in terrible shape when he inherited it. Ted was not particularly interested in having anything to do with news, except that he got dazzled by the technology. And when he bought that UHF station that you mentioned in Atlanta, that was left for dead. He bought it for the equivalent of a song, and he didn't even know what he was going to do with that, but it was just so cool to have a television station. It was much sexier than billboards. And he just started experimenting, and basically let the people who work there start experimenting. And then it's all a moment in time story, Frank, like all good stories are, because if it had happened 10 years earlier, 10 years later, we wouldn't be sitting here. Who knows what would have happened to either one of us. But basically, Ted was experimenting with putting out this UHF station on the cable, and then after a while, putting it up onto the satellite, just as satellites were becoming commercially available. Mm-hmm. And it's so unsexy, and it's so old-fashioned now, but that was a revolution to him, and he just wanted to do something more with that satellite. And the only thing he could think to do that hadn't already been done, which really basically, I'm sorry, it wasn't just that it hadn't already been done. He didn't want to co-opt the sports events that he put on his television station. He couldn't do entertainment because HBO had just started, and he also knew how hard it was to negotiate the rights to entertainment for television. So somebody said, let's do all news. And he thought, all right, I don't know how we're going to fill the time, but sure, I have no idea how to do that, but I'll go out and hire the people to do that. And that's what he did.
It was really, for him, it wasn't driven by this great sort of mission, even though when he did launch, he talked about this somehow bringing the world together and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really just a business decision. It was a business lane he chose to take.
Right. It would be like buying a football team, not because you love football and we're so passionate about it, but because, it seemed like a good possible return on investment. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's so interesting. I think that's the other reason, besides the milestone anniversary of CNN, that I wanted to write this book now, because, it's such a polarizing force right now. It's a war, actually. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. But that absolutely was not the impetus for Ted. It was not a war. He did see the power of television. He was aware of that, and he could see it just from running Star Trek, because he saw that people loved watching TV, and that it united them, hopefully in a positive way. So there were moments along the way where he saw the power of it being a positive force, but it was never a political thing. And it's really interesting to know that Ted Turner was actually very conservative back then.
Yeah.
People relate him to Jane Fonda, who was nowhere in the picture when he was building CNN.
Yeah. Well, and my sense is that he would much rather be on a sailboat than doing any of this. That it was only by accident that his father died that he had to sort of sidetrack his sailing career.
Right. Although he could have cashed out of the business when his father died and just gone and lived on a boat. But he basically wanted to avenge his father's death because of this complicated business deal that he felt drove him to suicide. So he didn't want to just go back and be a trust fund kid. He wanted to do something big. And that's the interesting paradox about him, because he didn't do anything halfway. All the while he was building up this television station in Atlanta with the help of a lot of people who were really devoted to doing it. He was jetting off and sailing all around the world and becoming the greatest yachtsman of his time, while simultaneously he was building up this UHF station into the top UHF station in the country. And so he was such an immersive, intense and crazy person. But yes, he could have at any moment just said, even when he bought the baseball team, the Braves, he wasn't into the baseball or the Braves, but he got into them, and he got so into them that could have been his main focus. But there was no halfway with Ted, and that's what makes him such a fascinating character.
He is such a fascinating man on so many levels, and as a young man who, you're right, I did want to go into the news business. It was just, CNN was just starting out as I was, thinking about it. And
Right.
And I so admired Ted Turner because he was this maverick. He was doing something different. He was doing news 24 hours a day. Obviously, the network has changed, and we've learned a lot about Ted Turner since. And I don't want to disparage the man, because I just don't. But he was complicated. I think that's an interesting word you use. I wanted to ask you, in the context of Me Too and different workplace cultures today, would Ted Turner have been able to do what he did back then?
Oh my God, no. It's actually, I'm with you. It's very complicated for me too. You talked to me last time about Ray Kroc, who was another fellow who would never have survived, but Ted amped it up to a different level, or at least in such a public way, he amped it up. Ray's generation, they were trying to conceal it a little bit, but Ted was larger than life, loved women, said the inappropriate thing. The inappropriate things seemed to happen constantly at this television station that he started. I mean, it seemed like a big fraternity, actually, in a way that I haven't found the people yet who didn't enjoy the party. It was a giant party at Channel 17. And even in the early days of CNN, it was a different era. People, I don't mean to minimize it at all, but people got away with more than they would ever get away with now. And that came from the top down. I think part of it was just television too, was crazy. You know, it's intense. You're working crazy hours, you're on the road, anything can happen, and it does. But with Ted, it was just to a new level, screaming off the side of the yacht to women to lift up their shirts, and they did. Even his friends would marvel at his behavior and say, I don't know how he gets away with it. But he seemed to. And how, yes, absolutely, how it would have worked today, it just absolutely wouldn't have. We would clamp down right away. Yeah.
And so, and this is a sort of a deeper question. In all the research that you did about Ted Turner, we're all complicated, but if someone were to ask you, was Ted Turner a good man? What would the answer to that be?
It's complicated. I wasn't married to him. I wasn't one of his kids. His kids had complicated relationships with him, and they all seem to love him today. To say that publicly, we all have complicated relationships with our parents, or maybe some of us don't. But he wanted to do the right thing. He, while he was decrying 70s television as being junky and bad for the family, he's running around with all kinds of women. But he wanted to do the right thing. You know, it's funny because we learn in studying the craft of biography, it's not our place to really say, but there's something so compelling about him. It's hard not to be drawn to him, even though the force that became CNN was completely an accidental invention. I mean, it's hard. I'm hedging my bets on it because I don't really know how to answer that, which is interesting, right? Like, you'd think that I would.
Well, I think like many people, it isn't necessarily a he's good or a he's bad, or, there are bits of both, as in most people.
Right.
But I was just curious to know, and we should say Ted Turner is still with us.
Yes.
But he is, what can you tell us about how he's doing?
Well, if you've seen any of the interviews, and there was a very moving one with Ted Koppel about a year or so ago, where he basically came out about the dementia that he has. It's called Lewy body disease. It's a certain sort of dementia that makes one hallucinate. He looks, if you've seen the Jane Fonda documentary where Jane Fonda goes back to see him, he looks like a different person, as we all do as we age. But yeah, so he's no longer active in that sense that he was then. And it's interesting and almost startling to see him now. His office was incredibly generous to me when finding information, certain videos that I was looking for, and particularly the one of him with Fidel Castro in Cuba, his first trip to Cuba. And that was also a pivotal point in his sort of enlightenment about the power of television.
Something that Mike Betcher, who people know, TV News, a legendary correspondent, Mike Betcher sort of brokered that.
Yes. Mike Betcher was such a delight. So many people were such a delight to talk to, because, who doesn't love tripping down memory lane, especially when in retrospect that you were making history. And Mike Betcher was just a young guy who really wanted to work in big time news. And he got out of Oklahoma thanks to CNN and basically became a national correspondent. He was the national correspondent when he was hired because there weren't others. They couldn't afford others. And he was going to Cuba, and people came up, the minders came up to him and said, you know, our people, our president wants to meet your president. And Mike Betcher thought, well, that means, you know, the president of Cuban television wants to meet Reese Schoenfeld, the president of CNN. And they said, no, Fidel Castro wants to meet Ted Turner. And basically Ted Turner went. So seeing Ted today, and imagining that, you know, what a bizarre moment in time that was, that he would get on a plane and fly and duck hunt with Fidel, all because Fidel was stealing the CNN signal and wanted to talk to this man who'd created this incredible phenomenon that he could sit and, you know, pirated watch this newscast. It's just, you couldn't make it up.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And I want to get to Reese Schoenfeld in a moment, because he's such an important person in the history of CNN.
Yes.
But before we get there, let me just finish this Cuba thought. You describe it as sort of an enlightenment of Ted Turner, and that it sort of changed him in some ways. And I feel like it changed the mission of CNN, or at least made him think of CNN differently. I know that when I was working there, one of the first things I was told is that we never say foreign. The word foreign was foreign. Because we saw ourselves as a US-based global news organization, so that wherever we went in the world, when we interviewed people, they wouldn't think that we were trying to impose our agenda upon them. We were there to hear what they had to say.
Right.
But what do you mean by Cuba being an enlightening moment for Ted Turner?
Up until that time, Ted didn't really truly understand the power of what it was he was doing. He left it in the hands of the news people who he hired, for the most part, with some instances where he didn't. But mostly he just said, you guys are the news people. I don't know anything about news. You deal with it. And so I'll get to more of that when we do talk about Reese. But basically, when he went to Cuba, he got an acute sense of the power of television in a different way than he had up until then, because he saw the power. He saw that Fidel was stealing the signal and fascinated by the idea of the stream of news. And it had never occurred to Ted that this was something that would have international appeal. He was just too busy trying to figure out how to put the satellite to use the way he'd done so with what became WTBS. So he basically, while he was there and face to face with this commie dictator, as he called him, he recognized that, you know, a commie dictator was a person too. He was smoking cigars. His girlfriend was with him. They were hunting together, and they were enjoying each other and talking about world affairs. And that, I mean, this is why we always say everybody should just, if we all hang out, there might not be a war, because basically in coming face to face with this man whom he had been taught was the enemy, and seeing that he had similar beliefs and differences, but hearing them articulated over rum put a fine point on it for him. And that's when he started to realize that there was a power of, and Mike Betcher talked a lot about that with me, that there was a power to bringing the news around the world, but also to listening to other points of view that may not be your own, even if it didn't persuade you to agree with it, to change sides, so to speak. At least if you listened, you might learn something. And that's the other irony with where we're at today, because that trip and his subsequent trips to see Fidel were really transformational.
So let's talk about Reese Schoenfeld. Everyone thinks of CNN, they think of Ted Turner, as they should. But he had to have a person who would execute that vision. And Reese Schoenfeld was a proper newsman, I would describe him as, working in New York, trying to put together an independent TV news cooperative, maybe you'd call it. And he and Ted had a sort of flirtation for a while, and eventually Ted calls him. And I think he calls him as the result of another death in his personal circle. It's the death of the general manager of the Atlanta Braves.
Yes.
At a young age of 43. And after this flirtation over a number of years, Ted finally calls him and says, and I'll let you use the salty language. What does he say?
Wait, now I can't even remember. It was like, let's do this fucking thing, I think is what he said.
I think that's what it was.
It's so interesting that you pointed out, and I haven't even thought about that in a while, is that CNN, Ted flirted with CNN, the concept of it, for a while, but he couldn't get the cable industry on board. Part of it was that the cable industry didn't think anybody wanted to watch 24-hour news, but they also didn't trust Ted to do it because Ted was such a wild man.
Right.
You know, how could he possibly do news? And news was so sober, and Ted was not that person. Famously not that person when he won the America's Cup and went on the air very drunken. So he had a hard time raising the money. And when the general manager of the Braves died, an early death, Ted was jolted, as many of us are when that kind of thing happens, into action. It's like, why should we wait? Forget it. I don't care if I don't have the money. I'm going to go ahead and do it. And Reese had been waiting his whole life for this moment. Reese had been trying to buck the system. He had been bucking the conventional 3 networks all his life as best he could, but that was a very hard thing to do back before the technology made that possible. So all of a sudden, Reese is called to Atlanta. It's a go, let's do it. And he's got to do it fast. And so Reese snaps into action and starts hiring everybody he possibly can who will come join this crazy effort, which nobody believed would work and which didn't have any money even after it launched. So yeah, it's incredible in hindsight or now to think about that.
Reese is such a tragic figure too, though, because he goes all in with Ted. It's the realization of a dream. They launch this network. It becomes successful, and you can put any number of metrics to it, and some might say it wasn't that successful, but it was going. And then at a certain point, he's gone. I mean, Reese is gone. And you described the scene that really touched me of a reunion many years later, when they all come together to celebrate what is now a very successful CNN.
Right.
Reese is sort of already out of the picture at that point and comes to this thing. And I don't know how you want to get to that, but it's such a touching moment.
It's so, I think what I found so compelling about this story, besides how larger than life Ted is that Reese, we've all had ventures that we've participated in that, either didn't work out the way we thought it would, either us or the venture or both. And Reese knew going in what Ted was all about. And Reese knew going in that it was Ted's sandbox. But he, as did every single person in that early part of CNN, felt immense ownership of it. And it was almost inevitable that they'd butt heads, and it was almost inevitable that there would be a parting of ways. And Reese spent the rest of his life inventing and reinventing and getting involved in so many formidable things, but he never could put what happened at CNN past him. And it was that day on the 20th anniversary where he finally allowed himself to feel the feelings he'd been feeling and suppressing all those years. And it's heartbreaking. And yet at the same time, that's another reason that I found writing this book so fascinating because, it helped me sort of process all the places I've left. And I love startups. Being part of startups is always fascinating. And it really resonated for me, this grown man who's had a great and fascinating life, feeling crushed by defeat.
Yeah.
And just feeling, the worst thing the thing we all want is to feel recognized in some way, and that he isn't recognized today. I mean, heck, Ted Turner isn't probably by a lot of people still known as someone, certainly people of a certain age, young age, may not know who he is, but they definitely aren't aware of Reese. So yeah.
You mentioned the startup culture, and that's one part of this book that really got to me. You describe the scenes of these young people coming together and saying, we're going to be part of this mission. We're going to create this news thing. And they're not, it really reminded me of the .com startup culture in a way. And instead of grinding and programming, they were grinding to create news and to put together this thing that they all believed in. And if you can, just give us a sense of that, because I found it very energizing to think about all those young people in Atlanta building this thing.
Driving their cars, going to work for $3 an hour or 3 and change, and not knowing what was going to happen because no one had ever done this before. I mean, there's all kinds of startups, but there's very few moments in time like that moment in time in 1979 and 1980. This time in 1980, they were all working round the clock to practice in this place where hammers and nails and equipment and everything was being installed. And I talked to a number of the people who were in the original VJ program, video journalists, these young people. They tried to make it sound much more vaunted than it actually was, because they were paying these people such pathetic money. And just this story, one guy, John Towers, who just said, sir, I don't know how to do anything. He got an interview. He was so thrilled to get in the door and to get an interview. And the guy sitting across from him said, what can you do? He said, I really don't know how to do anything. And the guy said, oh, well, that's good. Then I can make you do anything here. I can put you anywhere.
You're perfect.
And then, you're perfect. And the poor guy had been working construction for $9 an hour, but he was so desperate to get into TV that he took a pay cut and moved from home, from Indiana. I think he was even married at that point. He was a young married guy. But there's story after story like that of people who were willing to bet the farm, and many, many, many of them. It would be so amazing, Frank. And I thought about this when I first started working on this project and then realized it was impossible. But it would be so amazing to do a database of all the people who put their foot at CNN anytime in this past 40 years, but particularly that first 10 or 15 year period, and what they went out, and it would be like mapping the coronavirus. I mean, it's like mapping the entire industry. Traces back to this old country club in Atlanta that was retrofit for CNN's use. It was incredible. But yeah, I'm so glad that excitement comes through, because I felt it a little bit even when I started working there, and it certainly wasn't the beginning, but the energy and enthusiasm and just what the hell, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Thrill of it is, it really ruined me for life, because any place you work that's already set up, if you get hired to replace some other person, no matter what the job is,
right.
The guy who comes in and does your job, as great as your job is, and as great as he might be at it, if you are inventing that job, that's the coolest thing. And that's what was CNN back then.
Yeah. So let's skip forward a little bit to the actual birth of the network. So these folks have been working around the clock. They work all day, party all night. They're banging nails. They're rehearsing their heads off. And finally, the first broadcast happens. Take us through what that moment was like. And by the way, it really, to me, brought out the showman in Ted Turner in a way that it's not the way networks are launched today, I
I wonder. I mean, he what really is incredible is that he showed up for the opening on June 1st, 1980, and then went back up north to sail in the America's Cup. But yeah, he had a sense, he had a huge sense of pride about the place, of course, and who wouldn't? It was such a dazzling looking space. Just the satellite farm alone was so phenomenal. All those satellites out in this old country club's backyard. But yes, he had this grandiose, nothing is done in half or by half for Ted. So he had these military bands play, do the color guard, and basically he had them play Nearer Thy God to Thee, My God to Thee, before launch, and recorded it because he said, we're going to stay on, this network is going to stay on until the end of the world. And he just, he knew how to throw a party, and he threw a party that was fun for the people who attended it. There was a lot of booze, but for the people working there were people who were upset if they weren't scheduled to work the first day, which was a Sunday, because they wanted to be part of the history. And basically, once it started, it just was a newscast. It was a newscast followed by another newscast, followed by another newscast. And there was hopefully some news happening too, but it was all of this. That's the other reason startups are so fascinating. It was all this buildup to this moment where it just hummed along a well-oiled or somewhat well-oiled machine. And then they just had to worry about doing it over and over and over again. Yeah. So that first day, though, it is interesting. They tried to keep the VJs out from the party. Only the luminaries, the dignitaries could imbibe and eat the shrimp and hang out on the lawn. But it's just phenomenal to look at that video. You can look at that video on YouTube and see a little bit of it, and it's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, let's skip forward to what I think is one of the first events to put CNN on the map. And I think a lot of people associate that with the beginning of the Gulf War. But even before that, Ronald Reagan is the president.
Right.
He's at the Capitol Hilton. As he's coming out, shots are fired. Sissy Baker is on the assignment desk in the DC bureau. Bernard Shaw has been lured over from ABC News to anchor out of the Washington bureau. What happens?
All hell broke loose in a different way than it would have had it happened, when it did happen several years earlier when President Ford was at the other end of a gunman. Basically, back then, they were shooting film. News people were shooting film. Now there was CNN and there was video, and it could be instantaneous or near instantaneous. And so Sissy heard this call. She happened to have a crew inside. Nobody else had a crew inside because the president was just giving a regular, boring old speech, which is the kind of thing that filled the days on CNN. It was fantastic filler. So she dispatched her crew outside. But the problem was that the crew had not, just as CNN had not, been accepted by the White House press pool. So there was, there's this convention, if anybody watching this isn't in the news business, there's this convention of sharing tape, especially among the president, because that way you don't have 50 people around the president wherever he goes. So whoever's turn it is to shoot that video that day shares it with the others. And they weren't going to cut, there was a crew outside with the president, and they weren't going to cut CNN in on the deal. But Reese said, screw that, I'm running it, because a pool is a pool, and we're out there, and it's denying our rights if you don't let us have that videotape. But what was also important about that day was, even though still there were just several million people wired to cable, and of course most normal people at that point wouldn't have a television on, even if they did have cable, what was so important about that day is that the Washington press corps took note of the fact that Bernie Shaw was very measured and deliberate and didn't rush to air with the erroneous news that Sissy Baker's father had transmitted to CNN, and that others knew, which was that the press secretary had died. He did say it on the air, but he tempered it, and he only said it after the people he worked for yelled at him, "We've got this story, you've got to go on with it." And he said, "No, I don't, because I haven't verified it." So his measured, deliberate belief about fact checking, which of course is impossible to imagine in this day and age, he sort of saved the day and made people aware of the fact that this place meant business.
I want to touch on the fact that you didn't write an authorized history of CNN. It's specifically an unauthorized one. Why did you choose that way?
If you write an authorized book, it's filtered through that corporate parent or that individual. And that doesn't make it less valid. But first of all, I couldn't even get through to the right CNN people. The institutional memory at places is so thin. I hope that's not true at KTLA because of the rich history there. I'm pretty sure it's not. I've seen a lot of old documentation that shows that people understand the role in history that your station had. But I thought it was most important to go directly to the people who were there, but also to look at that moment in time more widely than a sanctioned, if CNN were to have hired me to write a book, they wouldn't have wanted that story about KTLA in there. They wouldn't have wanted the crazy stories about Ted in there. They would have sanitized the story. And, it would have been milestone pictures of all the famous people, Christiane Amanpour, who's had a fabulous career thanks to CNN, or the Gulf War guys, in the hotel as the world was exploding around them. Yeah, that's all really interesting. And there have been many books, Tiananmen Square, Mike Chinoy, unbelievable stories. His book is incredible. But what was more interesting to me were the people, with the exception of Ted, who you don't know, who most people don't know, who don't get the credit, who put themselves on the line, and the stories that would not work in a corporate sanctioned history biography. So, there are many books that have been written about Ted, and there's one about his environmental work. Everything, is purely latter-day Ted work. And it's fabulously interesting to see where he's put some of his loot. I mean, he's done some formidable work, but it's written in conjunction with Ted, which is completely different than a book that's written the way mine is.
Yeah.
So.
As someone who worked there, when you went back to look at the history, did anything surprise you? Did you learn anything that you didn't know?
Oh, everything. I didn't know any of this. I was just a dumb kid. I had a couple of internships. I had 3 internships. When I got out of college, basically it was the logical place to hit up for a job. The only place they would take me was if I moved to Atlanta. And I knew that this, you can't help but see that picture of the original CNN building and not think, wow, this is beautiful and fascinating. I mean, it's this old, literally an old Gothic, it looks like there could be a horror movie shot there, or a, Gone with the Wind, Tara on Techwood. But I didn't know anything about, I knew that Ted had a billboard company. I knew that he had TBS. I knew that there was wrestling. I knew the Braves, because we got free Braves tickets, but it didn't stitch it all together the way most of us don't when most of us don't understand our family history, even if we're told by our grandmother and our parents 1,000 times. It doesn't click into place until you're older yourself and you start to trace it all together. And that's why I thought that this was an interesting time to write this book, because enough time has elapsed that what he pulled off, what they all pulled off, especially now since, here's our TV studio in our hand. I learned everything I wrote about was news to me. So
have you had a chance to talk to people who were of that era, the CNN people, and have they had a chance to read the book and react And are their recollections what you have written about? Have they had different thoughts? What's the feedback been from them?
The greatest feedback so far has been from Ted Kavanaugh, who was one of the biggest deputies, if you will, of Reese in the newsroom. Wild character, couldn't have made this guy up. He always had a suit on and a gun on his shin, and they called him Mad Dog. And he'd come from Channel 5 in New York, which was a notorious, crazy tabloid station. And I was frankly afraid to talk to Ted Kavanaugh, but I knew that he was important in the story. And several of the other people at that level, at that higher level, are gone or not able to really communicate. So I had sought him out reluctantly, and he was such a sweetheart to me. And he even said, he's in his late 80s now, and if he's listening, hello, Ted. He said to me, I am not going outside because I don't want to get the virus. I can get the virus after I read your book, but I'm waiting for your book to show up. And so my book showed up, and he read it, and the email dropped in my inbox, and he said, I got it. So I was thrilled about that, because I've been very worried. There've been people who criticize me on Facebook. Who are you? You weren't there at the start. No, I said, I'm not writing about myself. Talk to me. I want to hear your story. And I've heard from several other people who were there at the beginning who said, I got it. So Sandy Kenyon read that excerpt in Vanity Fair of the Reagan day, the Reagan shooting. And he was the guy underneath Bernard Shaw, feeding up the wire to him. And he said, I got it right. So that's gratifying. I mean, I wrote this book more for your kids' generation when they're curious about the business, but it's a thrill when people who were there, they catch the energy of it. So, but Ted Kavanaugh was, I can just die and go to heaven now.
The one thing that I think people outside of the news business associate as the big moment for CNN is the beginning of the Gulf War. CNN was there providing live pictures, the glow in the sky of all the, the anti-aircraft missiles and bombs going off. And you barely touch on it. And I wondered why.
So I made a calculated decision. The first thing, when you write a book, especially like this, you have to figure out whether you're going to do, what you're zeroing in on. And that moment in time, there have been terrific books written about the boys from Baghdad. There have been movies made about it. They got the glory years ago. But I just, because of that little girl in the well in 1949, and then nearly 40 years later, Kathy Fiscus to baby Jessica, that seemed to me a way to cap the story. And then, not to give the whole story away, but the boys from Baghdad, fantastic. Tiananmen Square, fantastic. Shuttle Challenger, amazing. Horrible, but amazing stories conveyed in a way that made America see. As cable penetration was growing in the 80s, those milestones happened. Bizarrely, it happened, as cable was coming into the home, as CNN was expanding internationally, those events, Challenger, Tiananmen, Baghdad, occurred and drew people to their screens. But I just really wanted to capture those first few years that were so precarious, the first year before, where there were so many things that happened that could have derailed CNN, and then just cap it with that very first oomph for CNN that gave it its biggest ratings. Also because, arguably, a little girl in a well is not a news story. And there was some controversy about whether following this terrible misfortune for a family really constituted news. Was it the whole reason you started a 24-hour news channel? I thought that was important, especially now, to hammer home and to show that 40 years earlier, it had also been in question too, that the human interest is always so compelling, but it's not always, of world import the way Baghdad was. So it was really just, there was no, that's a long way of saying there was no serious reason other than it just gave me a framework. And that was just something that it's been documented. I wanted to look at things that had not been.
And finally, I touched on this earlier. I don't think you want to go there, but I have to ask you about it because you and I both work there. I continue to love CNN and my colleagues who are still there, but the network has clearly changed, and it has pivoted in a way at times that seems a different place than the place that I worked at and that I think you worked at. There are much more opinionated people on the air who are still news people, but they're giving their opinions. When I was there, it was the news was the star, and you talk about that in the book. There were some bigger personalities that were coming, but it was still much more of a, we're doing shows of record, we're doing the news, and it's not about you, it's about the news. In the conversations that you had and the research that you did, what can you say about how people feel about how internally the network has changed?
I think most people are not thrilled with how CNN, I think most of us old-fashioned purists, and I hate to call us that, but that's what we are, old guard journalists, would never have let opinions seep in. And I think what happened with CNN is that once the competition came, it changed the entire equation. So I think, I personally don't watch a whole lot of news. I certainly don't watch 24-hour news. And I think that a lot of people feel disappointed with the way things are today. Even Ted Turner has in recent years said that he's disappointed with the way things have turned out. So it's complicated. I've been joking during this horrible, horrible time that we should just really reset. No 24-hour news. Let's go back to the way it used to be, where there's news at 6:30 or whatever arbitrary time, and have a roundup, because otherwise you're fueling this fear, the horrible fear, by having to fill the time with rumors and statistics. And yeah, but I tried to stay out of that in this book. My whole hope was that whoever read it could step back, whether they're a journalist who had the benefit of being from the other era of television, or whether they're a young person wanting to go into the business, or just, somebody's mother who enjoys watching, that they'd ask themselves those questions about what's important and how information's conveyed. And that was my real hope.
Well, I have one more question before we get to the questions from the audience. And it's the question that I used to ask people when I would interview them when I was at CNN and interviewing someone on tape, which is there anything I forgot to ask you? Is there anything that you wanted to say that I haven't asked you given you the opportunity to say?
No. I think you covered it all. I don't want to cover all of it because I want everybody to go out and read this book. I'm very proud of it. No, I think that's really the capstone. What we just said is news is different. This is not about politics, which is what it has become. It's about asking ourselves, what's the most important way to get information, and how did we get to where we are today? So that's what history is all about, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lisa. I believe we have some questions now from our audience.
Yes, thank you, Frank. Several questions. The first one comes from someone who has read the book. She says, it's safe to say, having read your book, that if one were to wager whether CNN would have made it or not, the bet would more likely be on them failing. Why do you think CNN succeeded?
Basically, they just kept at it. I mean, it's like any startup. It wasn't an instant success. It was a very slow burn to success. And Ted kept leveraging himself and famously with the MGM CBS deal, which I won't get into here, almost destroyed himself. Cable invested in the channel eventually, and they wanted to keep it going. I mean, it could very easily have not gone on, but because they were committed to it, it's like the guy with the restaurant who says, I'm going to make it 5 years, whether it's going to kill me or not. And that's basically what he did. He was committed to it, but it was very, very precarious. Yeah.
So back in 1980, had Ted Turner not created a 24-hour news channel, do you think somebody else would have? And when might that have happened?
Right around the same time, people were talking about it. And there's a fantastic story that I learned in the research of this book, which was that HBO, which, as we talked about, beat CNN to the cable satellite marriage just by a little bit. And it was not like HBO is today. It wasn't 24 hours. It wasn't a sure thing either. HBO and Jerry Levin thought about doing 24-hour news. They experimented with it, and they even hired Reese, the guy Ted hired, to do a pilot. So all the networks, as they saw this marriage of technology, were thinking about it, but they just didn't know how to do it. And CBS was very, very close, actually. I've talked to people who've talked about that. And they House of Murrow, Walter Cronkite, they were very excited about it, but it was just the logistics of doing it and doing it in a place where there was a union. But yeah, it's like McDonald's, if somebody hadn't done what Ray Kroc and the brothers McDonald did, somebody would have. Actually, they were doing it then. It's just they came to fruition sooner. And that's same thing here.
I understand you did not interview Ted Turner for the book. But assuming he was in better health, if there was a question or two, you could have gone and asked him, what might that be?
I would have asked him more about that Cuba trip, because I just find that so fascinating, that he went, that Fidel let him into his personal world. Yeah, I would love to have that conversation with Ted. Ted is so well documented. Just the yachting films alone. Watching the yachting films is a joy. I can watch them over and over again. He's crazy in them. He's handsome as can be. He's screaming and yelling and shouting. They're amazing films. So maybe a little bit about that, but there's almost there's almost nothing left to ask, because he says so much. He did not hold back, did not mince words. And there are a couple of instances where people have said, there was one point where he lost, there was one point where he was, you know what, I'm going to let somebody read the book and see it. Yeah.
So you mentioned reviewing these yachting tapes. So the next question is research related. It said, I'd like to know more about the research you had to do to tell this story. Tell us about some of the great finds you had and how you found them.
Okay, well, the yachting, it was just a matter of money and searching. But Reese Schoenfeld wrote a memoir, and I was reading press about the memoir when it had come out 20 years ago. And in it was a throwaway line about how he'd hired a woman named Chris Chase to write the book for him initially, and then he'd thrown out the book that she wrote. Well, I happened to have interned with Chris Chase at my first job at CNN in 1981. So not only did that as a researcher make me go crazy, where's the book that they threw out? How can I get my hands on it? But I also knew Chris. Chris is basically my first boss. So I very quickly discovered that Chris was deceased. And I sleuthed out her heirs, which was not an easy thing to do because she didn't have any children. But long story short, I was doing a deal in the parking lot of our apartment building on Bunker Hill, giving floppy disks to some guy who drove in from the valley. Once I got my hand on these disks, waiting to see what was on them. And she had done a lot of oral history work back 20 something years ago. And of course we all have stories that we tell 1,000 times, but I figured what she had 20 years ago, was going to be interesting. And it didn't even matter. I just had to see what was on those discs. So that was the biggest find, but there was just endless. The other thing was finding the tape of Ted with Fidel in Cuba. That was really hard to find. Mike Betcher dug through all of his closets and couldn't find it. And I knew there were just a couple of other copies. And finally I got my hands on it. That was pretty good. Very proud of myself.
There's another research related question, and I'm inferring from it, it's more sort of a commentary on our times too. Back then, a lot of the research may have been in the form of letters or papers, that somebody, quote unquote, left to an institution or such. Fast forward to today, so much communication is digital. So, looking to 40 years from now, how complicated is it going to be to research today's digital troves? Are people even giving digital archives away to institutions?
I think they are. I just can't even imagine. I cannot imagine. This is now my second book, and I'm actually working on a third book right now that's stuck in the 70s. And that's hard enough because that's this weird digital netherland that not everything is digitized. Stuff before newspapers. It's not always easy to find stuff from the 70s, which sounds strange. But going forward, man, I can't even imagine. We'd have to ask a research librarian, because I know that research librarians are and archivists are working on that, but I don't want to. I'm glad I won't be around for that.
Two more questions. One says the technology in 1980 versus the technology in 2020 that we are now seeing that is so uniquely able to allow news organizations to continue to do their work is vastly different. If you were to imagine a pandemic happening in 1980, how would CNN be covering it?
Frank, what do you think? I mean, you wouldn't be able to work at home, right? There's no way.
No, I think that's a really good question. And I think that correspondents and crews would approach it as they do any war zone. You do the best to protect yourself, and then you go in and report the story. I do think that the approach to covering government would be a little, I don't want to say less aggressive, but it would be less tinged with the politics of it. Although, in the defense of our colleagues at CNN, so much of everything is against a backdrop of politics and an overlay of politics. And I think it's hard today to get to the truth, because there are folks out there who are trying to derail you from the truth or offering alternative facts, whatever they are. So, it requires a constant fact checking of this president and this administration, which I think comes off sometimes as this antagonistic, sarcastic sort of thing that maybe some of the personalities on CNN have taken it there. But I think the way the old guard would have covered it would have been much more of a drier approach, I think. But who knows?
Right. It's hard to really know, but definitely even when you extricate the politics from it all, even if just the idea of the technology is so amazing, because it is phenomenal that you can work at home and that people can transmit information about themselves, like camera shots, lay people, not just anchor people like you, thanks to this amazing tool. Yeah. So that opens up a whole world that's just not possible. When you look at the pandemic coverage from 100 years ago, obviously there was no broadcast media, but just think about, the public safety bonus of now versus 100 years ago is that you can convey much more quickly how to be safe, how to get tested, how to get information. So that's pretty phenomenal. The flow of information works on our favor, hopefully now. Well, maybe it makes some people anxious, many people anxious. So, but yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's just a fascinating thing to think about.
No, the technology alone, I remember when we were on the USS Constellation in the Persian Gulf at the beginning of the Second Gulf War, and I was going live via what we called video phone then.
Right.
And we would have to set up these panels and shoot toward a satellite over the Indian Ocean. And we just thought, we were amazing doing that. And, and I was pixelated, you could barely see us. And now, just like this, people are live anywhere in the world. And as you say, it's not through some amazing feat of technology. So you just turn on your phone.
When I first became aware of you, we were working in Greensboro, Winston-Salem, High Point a long time ago, and a microwave truck was revolutionary, right? The fact that you could pull up outside a city council meeting and feedback for the nightly news that was, wow, we're so
Right.
great. So it's, yeah, God, no, I'd love to ask you more about your time at CNN, because it is just each couple of years, the leaps and bounds have been phenomenal.
Well, I'm sure like many other former CNNers, I was quite disappointed to look into the index and see that my name was not listed. But I guess that I was after, the first part of the network. So
that's the sequel. That's the sequel.
Right.
Or when you
years.
Right. When you commission me to do your memoir, don't worry. We'll take care of it. So, no, that was the other daunting thing about this, is because so many incredible people worked there. I think that's why I chose that focused scope, because to do anything wider and to do it in the timetable that I needed to.
Well, at least you mentioned Oprah Winfrey.
Yeah.
Right.
The fact that Oprah Winfrey could have been Larry King before Larry King was Larry King. Kind of amazing. She was an unknown and they passed her over just like that. Oh, yeah. No. She's not experienced.
We don't want the Michael Jordan of broadcasting on our team. No, thanks.
It goes back to what we said before. It's not always a home run for everyone everywhere we go, right? It's crazy. And imagine if they'd hired her. Oh, yeah. Crazy.
And the final question, a lady says, your most recent book was a biography of a prominent person, a personality in her own right. This one is essentially a biography of a company led by a personality in its early years. Any similarities between writing and or researching about a person or a company?
Wow, that's a really smart question. Yeah, I mean, it's really the same thing. It's just that you're zeroing in on people, hopefully, to bring it alive. So it's not just about a company, which is another reason why writing a company history for the company might not be as interesting. It's more interesting to do it yourself and figure out who the players are. But yeah, it's really pretty much the same. Right now, I'm writing a book about the founding mothers of National Public Radio. So I'm researching early National Public Radio and those for women in pretty much the same way, just looking for clues wherever I can find them. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. It's great having you back at Live Talks Los Angeles. Thank you, Frank. Again, a reminder, Lisa's book is Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News, and is available wherever books are sold. You can purchase a signed copy in the link in the comment section. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.